My name is Steve Schneck. I'm the director of the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at the Catholic University of America, and one of the sponsors of this evening's event, the other sponsor being the Office of Migration at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. So welcome to you all. At this time, I'd like to invite Bishop Ricardo Ramirez, Bishop of Las Cruces, to start us this morning with an invocation. Bishop.
In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Gracious God, we thank you for bringing us together today. It is altogether right that we meet during this blessed, grace-filled season of Lent, when we reflect on our personal lives, but also on our society. We meditate on the things we're doing right and the things we're doing wrong. Today we'll address one of those issues that's foremost in our minds and in our society, and that is the issue of immigration. Thank you, dear God, for you having been the first immigrant, going from your divine state to our human state through your Son, Jesus Christ. As being the first immigrant, you show us the way. And your Son is the way, the truth, and the life. And he himself was a person on the move, not only physically, but also morally, going from the Judaic world into the Gentile world, into the Samaritan world. He went from the male-dominated society of his day to include women in his agenda. We pray that we will also cross boundaries in order to serve you better. And we want to serve especially those who cross political boundaries, that they will be received with hospitality, respect. And we hope, dear God, that justice will prevail and that we will be instruments of that justice. Help us today and give us the encouragement that we so need these days. Give us enlightenment and move us to do even greater things. We ask you to bless this university and our bishops' conference and all those here, and bless all the work that we do, because the work that we do is yours here on earth. We pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Bishop Ramirez. I'd also like to note that Bishop James Tamayo of Laredo is with us today, and Bishop Eduardo Navarez of Phoenix is with us today. And I'd like to also especially notice that Ambassador Johnny Young, the Executive Director of the Office of Migration, is with us today as well. Ambassador Young. I have a few brief comments to frame things before we begin. Welcome, of course, to the event today, the title of which is The Catholic Church and Immigration, Pastoral, Policy, and Social Perspectives. This is co-sponsored by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops' Office of Migration and the Institute for Policy Research and Catholic Studies here at the Catholic University of America. I'm particularly pleased at the extraordinary array of speakers and experts that you will hear today, but I am also, frankly, amazed at the rich list of attendees who are with us today. It seems as if this will be a particularly fruitful discussion. Thank you all for your attendance. Immigration and migration, of course, are profound elements in changing the world. They change culture and values, language and literature, economy and politics, art, education, science and technology, and many more things as well. Its impact on religion is particularly unmatched. It impacts, for example, the intensity of religiosity. It impacts denominational changes in religiosity. Obviously, we're all familiar with its impact on liturgy, with religious participation. It impacts leadership and governance in churches. And of course, the particular topic that we're concerned with today, it impacts pastoral needs and pastoral practices. It's the impact on religion, and especially on the Catholic faith, that is our focus today. This is the topic for our discussions and our explorations. So let's begin those explorations. And at this time, I'd like to invite the first panel to come to the table here in the front. Thank you all very much.
Good morning. My name is Leslie Tentler. I teach history here at Catholic University. It is my privilege to add my welcome to Steve's, to Catholic University, and to the conference, and particularly, of course, to this first panel, which I guess, roughly speaking, deals with immigration and the Church's response to it, past, present, and future. I will do the matter of introductions very briefly, in good part because our panel almost literally needs no introduction. We have with us today Professor Timothy Mahar, who teaches with me in the history department at Catholic University and is also director of the American Catholic History Research Center and University Archives. He teaches and writes on American immigration in the past and American ethnicity. He concentrates especially, as befits his own ethnic heritage, on the Irish in America, and has written a prize-winning book on the history of Irish Americans in his native Worcester, Massachusetts. Father Virgil Elizondo is professor of pastoral and Hispanic theology at the University of Notre Dame. He has published so widely in theology, spirituality, culture, public ritual, that I would be standing here for 10 minutes if I were to attempt to list his various books and articles. Suffice it to say that the only possible rival he has as the expert on the Hispanic Catholic experience in the United States is our third panelist, Father Alan Figueroa Deck, who is Executive Director of the Office for Cultural Diversity in the Church for the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. He, too, has published extensively on Hispanic Catholic history and culture. So, we could not be in better hands. Tim Mahar will speak first, representing the Church's immigrant past. Father Elizondo will follow with observations on present-day immigration and the Church's response to it. And Father Deck will bring up the rear, talking about current pastoral practices in the Church, current policies on the part of the Bishops' Conference, which will obviously open the question of what more might be done in the future. After he has finished, we will then open the floor for questions.
Let me say I'm delighted and honored to be able to present to you today on this topic, which is of great moment for the country, but also a great personal interest and passion for me as well. Let me begin by talking about an historian, one of the great historians of American immigration. His name was Oscar Hanlon, one of the great historians in American immigration historiography. In 1951, he wrote a book called The Uprooted, which won a number of prizes, a kind of lyrical account of immigration history. But he opened the book by saying, "Once I thought to write a history of immigrants in America, then I discovered that immigrants were American history." For no people, perhaps only Hanlon's own Jewish people, but for no other people, perhaps more than for American Catholics, was this true. Immigrants made American Catholicism, made Catholicism in America. Without the torrent of immigrants who came in the mass migrations of the 19th and 20th centuries, Catholicism in America would have been tiny, small, inconsequential, a kind of island, a Catholic island in a Protestant sea, a kind of exoticism, perhaps. This was true because in colonial America, Catholics could not practice their faith. Only in Maryland, where there was a practical tolerance, were they allowed to practice, or in Pennsylvania, where there was a kind of official tolerance, were they allowed to practice. Everywhere else, Catholicism was illegal and was outlawed, and Catholics could not practice. So despite the fact that over 100,000, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people came to the United States in the colonial era who had been born Catholic, over 100,000, we estimate over 100,000 Irish Catholics came who had been baptized as Catholics. When the new republic emerged in the 1780s and 1790s, only about 25,000 or up to 40,000 Catholics emerged with that new republic. The numbers then were much smaller than the numbers who had actually come. And they were only about 0.5 to 1% of the whole American population at the time. Now we know that there were other settlements, Spanish settlements further west or to the south, parts of New Spain, that predated Jamestown and Plymouth and St. Mary's City. We also know that there were French settlements on the Mississippi River and down in New Orleans. But those settlements would not be incorporated into the American Republic for some time, most of them not until the 1850s. And even if we added their populations in the 1790s to that number on the East Coast, we would still get about 2% for the whole North American continental, what would become the United States. It would remain about 2% until about the 1820s. But even by that time, there had begun a mass migration, one of the great population movements of all time, a mass migration from Europe. Over 30 million people would come to the United States from Europe between the 1820s and 1920s. Hundreds of thousands more would come from Asia, and also millions would start to come from south of the border, from Mexico, in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. This migration, it's hard to know how many of these people were Catholic, but maybe as many as half were, maybe more than that were. In any case, the Catholic population began to skyrocket. It went from 2% in 1820s to 8 to 10% by the 1860s, and 18% by 1910. It would grow somewhat more after that into our present day, somewhat in between 20 and 25%. Further migration, a particularly strong Catholic baby boom. But Catholics, immigrants, had made Catholicism in America. Accompanying these people who were coming, farmers largely, artisans, were religious women, religious men. About 4,000 Irish-born Catholic priests came to the United States in the 19th and 20th century. Just between the 1830s and 1880s, about 1,500 Germans, Catholic priests, came to the United States. In 1917, there were about 400 Italian priests in the United States. Religious women, orders of religious women, also recruited heavily from overseas. Irish Sisters of Mercy, for example, Polish Felician Sisters. French-Canadian orders of sisters also recruited heavily from Canada to staff the American mission. These clerics and religious came because their countrymen and countrywomen came. Why did those people come? Well, they largely came for a simple answer, no matter what your Irish great-grandfather told you or Polish grandmother told you. They came because they were poor and they were afraid of becoming poorer. Why were they afraid of becoming poorer? There's lots of ways to describe this, but the simple term would be a term familiar to us today, and that would be globalization, the effects of globalization. There were many effects of globalization that forced this migration, pushed this migration. Some were beneficial. Foods in the early phases of migration, the colonial era, foods were discovered in America that came back to Europe or were spread to Asia. Foods that were particularly nutritious, potatoes, peanuts, etc., and became important parts of the diets of those other populations. In addition, the transportation changes that allowed globalization, railroads, steamships, made foods more readily accessible in crisis times. Not always. The Great Irish Famine, a great exception to that. As a result of this, population began to skyrocket in Asia and Europe and all over the world. Population grew enormously in the 18th and 19th centuries. But at the same time, globalization was causing problems for those growing mass of farmers and artisans. They were being dragged into larger markets where they found difficulty competing. If you were an Irish Irish farmer on a small farm in Wexford growing wheat, or an Italian on a small farm in Sicily on rocky mountaintops, or even in the French Canadian in the St. Lawrence River Valley, you had trouble competing with the huge harvests of wheat that were coming out of the Dakotas, out of the prairies, out of Nebraska, out of the steppes of Russia, or out of Argentina. Artisans had the same problem. German clockmakers, shoemakers, weavers had trouble competing as they were being inundated by goods that came from England, English factories, or eventually from their own factories. And so these people come to America. And they come to America and they come poor, and most of them stay poor. Most Catholic immigrants make only inching progress up the occupational ladder. German Catholics may be an exception. They came with more capital, they came with more skills, but for the most part, the progress is very slow. They had one advantage, however, over other immigrants, or the immigrants who come today, or maybe more than one advantage, but this particular advantage. The United States economy in the 19th and 20th century was creating an abundance of blue-collar jobs, manufacturing jobs. And in the 20th century, through the power of unions and government programs, the profitability and the value of those blue-collar jobs was growing significantly. These were jobs that didn't demand a lot of education. That is not true today. We're not creating those same kinds of jobs, and even the ones we create don't have the same kind of value. These people came speaking foreign languages. Even the Irish immigrants who came in the 19th century, 1/3 perhaps were Irish speakers, although bilingual. All the others were speaking foreign languages. And they insisted on preserving those languages. It would be perhaps an exaggeration, but not too much of an exaggeration to say that the greatest stimulus to parochial education, to the building of parochial schools in the 19th century, was the preservation of language as much as it was the preservation of religion. French Canadians, Germans, and Poles all were more likely to build parochial schools and more likely to send their kids to parochial schools than Irish Americans who spoke English. And the people who came insisting on those languages often ran into resistance from the church hierarchy, from the bishops who were often Irish American, who insisted on English. But there were also other sources of their discontent with authority in those days. There was discontent over parish finances, over control over lay societies. There was discontent sometimes over choice of priests. They were feisty and quarrelsome people. As my colleague Leslie Tentler has argued in her book on the Archdiocese of Detroit, it's the immigrant generation that is most passionate about how the church is run. Then it is that generation, much more than the more acculturated and upwardly mobile later generations. And it is they who are much more likely to fight over it. This image may jar us a little bit. We like to think, like all Americans, sometimes we like all Americans of European ancestry in multiple generations, like to look back on some golden era when their ancestors came and assume that they were all pious, eager for Americanization, and all upwardly mobile. That wasn't necessarily the case. Immigrants made America. Sometimes I think in the Catholic community we're also transfixed by the 1950s and all those rows and rows of boys in white starched shirts and girls in green jumpers in classrooms in yellow brick buildings all across America. And we think that it was always thus. But it wasn't always thus. Immigrants made America. Feisty, poor, speaking foreign languages, nonetheless, they made Catholicism in America. As we think how Catholicism might be made and who it might be made by in the future, it might be well, not just in terms of social justice and moral purpose to consider, but also our own interest to consider and to remember that immigrants made Catholicism in America. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for being here, for inviting me to say a few words. And I think one of the most crucial and challenging issues facing the church and society today, the whole issue of how we look upon immigrants. And I thought that we were supposed to address all 3 points, so I'm going to go real quickly to the first one. We're creating a television series in San Antonio right now on the contribution that the children of immigrants have made to making America great. Because we think that part of the challenge is to change the mindset of how people are looking at the immigrants today, that they're a burden on the country, they're simply taken away and so forth. And so how do we bring out the contributions that immigrants have made? But to begin with, I come from San Antonio, Texas, southwestern United States. That whole area was created by Catholic immigrants. They were the ones that created that area. That's why the names San Diego, San Antonio, Amarillos, San Francisco, it was created by Catholic immigrants. And they brought in things that are lasting today. For example, the cowboy industry was founded in La Bahia in Texas. And that's why a lot of the words are still in Spanish. So they created things that are considered super American today. And that was brought in by the Spanish immigrants that came in to start a new country, a new church, a new society. Their descendants today. Their descendants today are presidents of universities, the chancellors of the University of Texas system, so forth. So the history of immigrants has been one of continuous contribution to the growth and development of that area. And I think that's important to note, that immigrants are not so much a problem, but a contribution. Because they come and they want to work hard, they want to build, they want to create, they want to succeed. And they have that energy and that driving energy that's created by the dream to do something good. So I think to help to change that image of the immigrant as something negative, to see that something that's very positive come about. But I think as we face the new immigrants today, that is really the great challenge today. In many ways, through the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, many, many jobs were eliminated in Mexico. So many people that had a stable economic life found themselves without any type of job opportunity. So in many ways, the NAFTA agreement has created a need for people to come north seeking jobs. On the other hand, there were people inviting them to come. Many industries even recruited in Mexico and Central America for people to come. So you have many immigrants coming in, and also certainly the violence throughout Mexico, Latin America, and so forth. The violence is forcing many to choose between risking immigration or possibly dying. And so we have the new immigrants coming in, and the ones that are here, the millions that are already here because in some way, they were invited. Often people say, well, what don't you understand about illegal? So, well, in many ways, it didn't even enter their minds. I grew up in an area of the country where simply going to Mexico or Mexico here was simply, vamos para el otro lado. It wasn't crossing the border, it was simply going to the other side. Because there was a cultural unity, there was an ethnic unity. And so in a way, the political boundary was just something that you went across to the other side. So we do have many coming today. And what can the church do? What can the church do for the immigrants? And I think the first thing is to create a home away from home. People, many of them today are coming alone. They're not coming as families. And therefore the loneliness and the church as a place of social gathering, a place where they can hang around and meet people. I work in a parish in San Antonio now that was not predominantly Spanish-speaking, but there was a small group that came to the pastor and says, we want a Spanish language mass with Mexican music, with a lot of charisma and so forth. So the pastor finally gave in. We started that mass about 3 years ago now with about 90 persons. Now we're averaging 1,500 every Sunday. We didn't know we had that many people there. We know, and they come and they don't want to leave. That creates a little problem for the pastor who wants to clear the parking lot. Because our people don't just come to church and when they want to leave, they come and they want to stay. They want to visit with one another because that's the place where they meet each other. That's the only place. So for the church to be able to provide that space can be a common home away from home. I think it's the first great contribution we can make. But certainly also the churches will have symbols that the people will feel welcome. For example, no doubt for our Mexican people, Our Lady of Guadalupe. Once she's there, people know they're accepted. But as we start to get Guatemalans in, we found out their main religious symbol was the black Christ of Esquipulas, El Cristo Negro Esquipulas. So when I was at the cathedral, we brought a statue in. Immediately, more Guatemalans started coming in. Now, estamos en casa, Padre. Now we feel at home. Why? Because the religious symbol. So it's Nuestra Señora del Cobre for the Cubans. Whatever it is, the symbol, the core religious symbols of a people that tells them God is with you. You're not alone. You might be far away from home, but the God of your home is with you and is here with you. So I think the use of symbols in the churches, the use of music and language, the use of music communicates heart to heart. And there's nothing that brings people together more than the music that is co-natural to them. We have a great tradition of music in Latin America. Evangelization came through music. The whole evangelization of the enculturating of the faith came by creating music that had content but also respected the musical rhythms of the people. Musical rhythms are very profound. And so to have music there in the church that people come and they're going to feel at home, they're going to feel welcome. To create welcoming parishes. I think this is something that really creating a spirituality of welcoming in our parish, a spirituality of welcoming otherness, that they don't have to become like us because they bring something to us. As we offer something to them, they bring something to us. It's a mutuality of this change. They simply bring a new dynamism. They bring a new profound faith. When you listen to the stories of immigrants, I'm sure Father Grudy will be here later on today if he's not here yet, but the work he has done on collecting stories of immigrants crossing the desert, crossing the river, facing death every moment of their life, and yet their profound faith that they're not alone because God is with them. I think one of the great gifts that the immigrants bring to our church is that unquestioned faith in the providence of God, that unquestioned faith that no matter what happens, you have nothing to fear because God is with you. And the stories he has in his book, if you haven't read them yet, I recommend hide it to you. It's just the tip of the iceberg. So they bring to us that profound faith that whatever happens, God is with us, God has not abandoned us. So creating the parishes a space of welcoming. So often we hear from our immigrants around the country, they don't feel welcome in the church. They don't feel that this is their church. They feel like they have to stay in the back or something. They're not told to. But, there's many ways of communicating. And so I think to make our parishes a place of welcome that really rejoices because someone new is coming. They give us an opportunity to welcome the stranger, which is one of the final aspects of our final judgment, that we can be a parish that's a parish welcome to stranger. So I think that's so important for them, and also to help them adjust. To help the immigrants, for example, there's a program that started with Archbishop Gomez and a group called MAT in San Antonio. It's now spread in many parts of the country, called Maestro en Casa. How to teach English free of charge. Parishes get the books free, and all I have to do is get a local radio station to run the program a couple of times a week. So people can begin to learn basic English. That's practical English. Practical English, how to go to the store, how to go to the doctor, how to go to the grocery store, how to go to the drugstore, how to go to the bank and so forth. So practical things. They come in a totally strange country, and therefore they're exploited by everyone. Can the parish have a practical place? Even such a thing as how to send money to Latin America. One of the big challenges of immigrants is they want to send money home. Many come from starving communities. And no matter how little they make, they will sacrifice to send something home. But, there are outfits out there that will take 50, 60% of the money from them. So how can we help them with practical things? I think that could certainly be something the church is doing already and can do even more. I'd like to go mainly to the challenges of the future. I think the immigrants today, especially the undocumented immigrants, offer us a tremendous challenge and tremendous opportunity for the church to really rise up to a moment of incredible need at this moment of history. So how do we welcome the diversity of immigrants? How do we create leaders amongst them that can help each other? Because nobody understands one better than the other. So how can we provide a practical program for leadership? But how do we deal with the children of immigrants? I think this is one of the big, big challenges because many of the children of immigrants today are really suffering, especially undocumented. I've had a couple of cases, very painful cases, and I have to confess I don't know the final outcome because they never came back to me. But I had a couple of cases, both of them very, very charming young ladies who were graduating from high school. And they came to talk to me, and they didn't know each other, two totally separate cases, because they wanted to commit suicide. And they wanted to commit suicide because they struggled to get through high school. They'd done extremely well. They were top of their class. Everything you say about them was tops. But they couldn't go to college because they were undocumented. They couldn't go to college, and they were assured in their heart, they were sure that not only could they not go to college, but they would not have a job opportunity. So why be a burden on the family? Why even struggle when there's no chance for us? So maybe the best thing to do is just to end it on a good note. We've had a good high school. Maybe we should bring it to an end. Well, I prayed with them. I counseled them not to give up hope. There would be opportunities. And I have to confess, I don't know what happened. I never heard about a funeral, so I hope they didn't do the suicide. But this is the agony that's going on in so many of our young people. That many of them don't know whether they're USA or Latin American. They find themselves at an in-between. The immigrant knows they came over. They know they're an immigrant. They know they're going to struggle. Their children don't. And one of the biggest challenges to me is how do we deal with the immigrant youth that is there today and that ones probably feel the most alienated from either society. And that's the one that opens the doors for gangs, for drugs, for all kinds of other things. So I think how to address the question of the children of immigrants. What kind of services can we provide as society denies them more and more services? And can the church be a place for medical care? Can the church be a place that offers education? I think one of our great challenges of Catholic education would be to welcome the undocumented. Even our universities, I think, would be a great, great challenge. So how can the church provide those services that our immigrants are going to be denied more and more? And I think the biggest challenge to me, how can we change the average American mind in this country to take a different look at immigration reform? I think to me one of the biggest challenges and opportunities of Catholicism today is to change the ordinary Catholic mind that has so simplistic fallen into the mentality, they're illegal, send them home. It's amazing story to hear people consider themselves good Catholics and yet have an incredibly negative, hateful attitude. Archbishop Gomez recently gave a major presentation, that I would just like to quote from, because I think he really strikes it very, very clearly when he states that one of the critical challenges the church faces in the hemisphere, the greatest civil rights test of our generation is immigration. Certainly in Latin America, but especially in the United States. It's a tragic human cost of negative responses to immigrants among U.S. citizens. It is bad for the soul of the country. It is bad for the soul of Americans. That is poisoning the soul of Americans to almost deny the basic Christian mandate to love your neighbor, to reach out to the stranger and be a welcoming community. It almost poisons the mind of our Catholic people, what's going on today. And so there's too much hate, there's too much anger, there's too much resentment. I'm sure you have sensed it yourself. And it's incredible. It's painful to hear. People that are good friends of mine, and you hear them just come out with incredible, simplistic, hateful statements about the immigrants. Just send them home, lock the doors, don't worry what happens to them. He calls for a moratorium on state and local legislation and an end to federal worksite enforcement raids for deportations and breaking up of families. I'm sure many of you have dealt with this. I had a case in the cathedral where we were preparing for Holy Week. We were preparing for Christmas, and we had the annual posada, when you walk around seeking shelter. And as we were finishing the posada, seeking for shelter, a lot of our people were undocumented. Immigration made a raid, and several got taken away. And you hear across the country, you hear stories. So it's an incredibly human thing. It's almost, as a Jewish friend of mine told me, it's almost like the beginning of the Holocaust in Germany. And I think that is the mentality that, to me, is so fearful today. And I think the Catholic Church here has an incredible opportunity Certainly our bishops have made some very, very excellent statements. But how do we get that mentality across to the ordinary Catholic? That, to me, is the great challenge. How do we challenge our Catholic institutions, for example? Like, for example, EWTN. How do we challenge EWTN to really speak up the Catholic teaching on immigration? To really be Catholic. And what does it mean to be welcome, to reinforce the fundamental human right to immigrate because of human need? And that's not to disregard borders. The Catholic Church is very balanced in its teaching. But how do we get that across to people are against abortion, so are all of us in this room. But it seems that we don't care about aborting adults. You know, and I think we have to be concerned. But how do we change the Catholic mentality of Knights of Columbus, for example? They have so many units around. How do we get our campus ministries involved to change the mentality of university students? I work at a marvelous University of Notre Dame. We had a marvelous university-wide forum on immigration, yet we could not get enough student support for Notre Dame to support the DREAM Act. I mean, that was painful for many of us at Notre Dame, that we couldn't get enough student support at that university. And so how do we work with campus ministers? How do we work with campus ministers? How do we work with ordinary catechists? How do we work with ordinary pastors that can preach about this on a Sunday? That can preach about this on Sunday, and maybe some of the congregation will walk out, as happened with some pastors that preached on it, and said that a good portion of the congregation simply stood up in your sermon and walked out. But how can we really preach that this is Christian charity? This is Christian charity. Pope Benedict has brought out beautifully how the authenticity of the Eucharist, if it moves us to create a more human society, that's the authenticity of the Eucharist, not whether it's in Latin or rock and roll or whatever. Can it move the hearts? Can it move the hearts to really go out and be disciples in the world today? And so I think the challenges today of the parishes, immediately to be welcoming spaces. But beyond that, to work so we can have a welcoming society that doesn't criminalize the poor because they're poor and struggling for existence, for subsistence, that doesn't put them across as the greatest evil and throws all the problems of the country upon them. But they're human beings that are struggling. It's other human beings that struggle. We heard so beautifully. The Irish, the Polish, the Italian that came over and struggled like anything. So are people today. I think behind it, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of racist issues too. I think people are fearful of a Latin American takeover. It is not going to be the case. We know that. We'll bring something in, music and food and dance and festivity and many beautiful things. But we're not here come to destroy America. I think that some people bring that up, that we come here to destroy America. That's not the case at all. We come here to build it, but to make it a more human place, a more welcoming place. So I think that the church has done a lot. I think can do a lot more. I think this is the moment of real challenge. Can we get the teaching that our bishops have offered us, can we get that to the popular Catholic mind and make it the American mind, make it the American mentality, and make it the American Catholic voice? They'll go to our legislators and our congressmen and our senators. The reason they're not interested in immigration reform is because they don't hear from the people. And the ones they do hear from are negative. I've talked to several legislators, and they say they get 100 to 1 against immigration reform. So where is our Catholic voice? And I think that's where we can, today, to me, the great chance to mobilize all the different networks, whether it's the student networks or campus ministry, whether it's the Knights of Columbus or CWTN, whether it's women's societies or anything else, catechists, preachers, and to make immigration one of the great challenges and possibilities. That could be maybe our great legacy of this generation, that we have truly put our Catholic teaching as a force for the good to welcome the immigrants, because in welcoming them, we welcome Christ. In the immigrant poor, God continues to come to us. And that's our opportunity and our challenge. Thank you very much.
I very much welcome the opportunity to pull together some of the things that we've heard so far from our first two panelists in the hope of sharing with you what is, I think, a vision of what's going on, and then some sense of maybe where it might be going. I think that there's no doubt that we find ourselves at a critical moment in the history of the church in this country. We are truly beginning a new historical cycle. And the decisions that we make and the way that we respond to the topic that we're discussing here has everything to do with how alive, with how vital, with how engaged the faith of Jesus Christ in the Catholic tradition is going to be in this country. As Robert Putnam, in his recent book, Graced America, has pointed out, 6 out of every 10 Catholic youth under the age of 35 are Latino. And if you add, we haven't talked a lot about the Asian and Pacific Island peoples and other immigrant groups, so it's not just about Hispanics, but certainly the Hispanics is the biggest of those demographic groups. It becomes very clear that in our lifetime, in the past few years, a demographic shift of enormous implications has occurred. More than half of all our Catholic people are not of European background. They are people of Hispanic, of Asian, and African backgrounds. And the style of church we have, the leadership of the church that we have, the institutions that we have as Catholics must, in some respect, take this transformation into account and manifest the implications of those changes in many, many different kinds of ways. That's exactly what we are talking about when we talk about immigration. The Hispanics, as we heard, frame the history of the Catholic Church in this country. They were the first Catholics, and now they are the present and the future Catholics. It's no longer a church that it's Irish American or Italian American or Polish American. No, it's very much become a church of Hispanic Americans, and it will continue to become so as we move forward. Our structures, our church structures, our personnel, our leadership, our strategic planning still does not adequately reflect the changes that I have just outlined. And we must get to this. We must begin to work with this. Going back 60 years, the bishops have provided a vision. Like so many great visions and teachings, however, of our church, much of this vision that the bishops have proposed to us in the encuentro processes, in the work of the Secretariat of Hispanic Affairs going back many, many decades, in the work of the Secretariat of African American Affairs and other entities at the Bishops' Conference, a vision has been proposed, an idea of church, an idea of how we want to be church in the American context. And yet that teaching remains, for many of us Catholic people, the ones that Father Elizondo was talking about, who don't understand why the bishops have made such a straightforward commitment to the defense of immigrants. Many of our Catholic people don't have much of an idea of the vision that our bishops, and of course the Holy See in its teaching on the rights and dignities of immigrants, has been proposing for many, many, many decades, centuries even, we could say. So we do have a basis for it in the documents of the Encuentro and the documents that the bishops have proposed. In 1984, in their pastoral letter, they set the tone for this teaching, and they've never moved away from it. The fundamental point is the coming of new immigrants to this country must be understood, most of all, as a blessing, as an opportunity. And when we stop thinking of it as a blessing and opportunity, we're going to start doing things that are going to prejudice us and work against the real interests of the church and, I would say, our country. Second point I want to share with you, third point rather, U.S. Catholicism will be different. It already is different because of the coming of immigrants, as Dr. Maher pointed out. All the immigrants that have come here have made a difference, and I assure you that the Hispanic immigrants and the other immigrants here have and will be making a difference in our country. In the past 40 years, 4,000 Catholic parishes out of the 17,500 that we have instituted ministry in Spanish. 4,000, out of 17,500. Virtually all the dioceses in our country have some kind of organized Hispanic ministry. At the same time, something has occurred in the past 10, 15 years that is very, very new, at least in the 20th and 21st centuries, namely the coming of what we never had before, a Hispanic clergy that still is not anywhere close in terms of the number that we need to serve the number of Hispanic Catholics that we have, but something like 15 to 20% of our seminarians and of the priests that we ordain every year are now Hispanic and of other nations. And we are creating a new clergy in this country, one that little by little reflects the demographic that I just shared with you. And this is good news. The underreported story is the emergence of the permanent diaconate. We have more than 17,000 permanent deacons. More than 2,000 of them are Hispanic. So that this is an underreported success story. These are men and their wives who have come forward to be trained and formed for ministry, who are stepping up to leadership all over the country in many roles of service in the church. And this is a very, very important story. The other thing that's happening, and we see this probably more in the West and in the Southwest, but don't worry, it'll get here to Washington and the East Coast soon enough. We see the reality of leadership in the hands more and more of the Hispanic and the Asian and Pacific peoples and other groups of non-European origin. In many dioceses in the West and the Southwest, when we make a call at the parish or at the diocese for leaders, for volunteers, who's going to show up? The Hispanic people are going to show up. They're very interested in the church. They're very committed to the church. The percentage of catechists in a place like Los Angeles that are Hispanic is overwhelming. It's like 75% of all the catechists in Los Angeles are Hispanic. The role that the movements play, like the charismatic renewal or the Cursillo or marriage encounter, in appealing to the Latino and in motivating the Latino to engage in the church is very important. It is mainly because of them that the charismatic renewal, for instance, in this country, is once again an often unrecognized but very important source of vitality for the church. So that in the development of movements and the role that they play in the pastoral life of the church, the Hispanics have a role, and they are playing that role. Surveys have shown that more than 50% of the Hispanic Catholic community in this country has been influenced significantly by the charismatic renewal. So there's a style of Catholicism that Latinos are bringing to the Catholic Church. We're going to move somewhat away from the Enlightenment, the more rationalizing approach to communicating our faith, to an approach that is more reflective of Hispanic Catholicism, an approach that is more expressive, an approach that probably gives a greater importance to the aspects of symbol, aspects of ritual, an approach really that is in some ways very comfortable with the sacramental tradition of the Catholic Church. We're going to see it in a kind of Catholicism that is more, as Father Elizondo has pointed out so often in his writing, more focused on the celebratory or the festive aspects of our faith. A way of being Catholic that brings life, that brings vitality. And all you have to do is travel around this country, as I've had the wonderful opportunity to do in the position I have, and see the life that immigrants, particularly the Hispanic immigrants, are bringing to every nook and cranny and corner of the Catholic Church in our country. Where is the Catholic Church growing the fastest in our country? In the South. In the past 15 years, the Catholic population of North Carolina has gone up to 200%. The Catholic Church is a reality, is a presence in the South, in a way that it never was because of these immigrants. The Catholic Church is truly a national presence because of the Hispanic immigrants. The Mexican immigrants are coming into New York now, by the way, and joining with the Puerto Rican and the Dominican and other Latin American peoples to strengthen the church here in the East Coast. And we see it here in Washington. It's very, very obvious what's going on. For me, then, the underlying question has to be the evangelization of culture. Because we Americans have gotten used to being American, because the European Americans that Dr. Maher talked about assimilated, and we became, as it were, as American as apple pie. This brings with it very serious questions, because one of the unfortunate implications of that process has been we are Americanizing people out the front door of the Catholic Church. The younger American, European American Catholic, as you know, many of them, a significant percentage of them, are disenchanted with the church for whatever reasons. This must be a serious challenge to us. Recently, we have heard that now the great challenge for the Hispanic Catholics is not so much the appeal of evangelicalism and Pentecostalism, even though certainly that's still a reality that appeals to many of our people. The greater challenge is to the movement to a secular way of life, that is, the abandonment of the Hispanic Catholic, of the faith of their ancestors. What can we do in the face of this encounter between Catholic identity and American culture? The church, at every group within the church, including the Hispanics, including the Asian peoples, including the African immigrants and so forth, all of us have to become experts in culture. We have to understand the difference between our Catholic identity and our U.S. American identity. We have to develop a capacity to be culturally discerning, to know what really is consistent with what the church teaches, with what the gospel of Jesus Christ is about, and what isn't. We have to assume, once again, something that undoubtedly will make us uncomfortable. That posture of engagement that characterized the Polish immigrants and the Irish immigrants and the Italian immigrants who came to a land where they knew that they were different, and they knew why they were different, and they struggled to identify that difference and to maintain it in some respect, mainly the difference that came from their Catholic identity, of which their language and their customs was an important vehicle. We Catholics today must look at our church, which is poised between two interesting identities: a European American middle-class church with its institutions, with its way of doing things, yes, with its wealth, which in recent times, I think we know, is being diminished. That church, at this point, one could say, at a certain moment of, yes, decline. And the other church, at this wonderful moment of opportunity, with youth, with new blood, with new opportunities, and new challenges. It seems to me this is exactly where we are. And the question of how we relate to the immigrants is the critical question on what and how the Catholic Church will engage the American experiment. And I think that's where this conversation, I think, really needs to go. Thank you.
Now I would like to open the floor to questions or comments. There's a microphone in the center of the room. That's the only one, Steve? Okay, so given the size of the room and it's not terrific acoustics, if you would come to the microphone to ask your question, that would be greatly appreciated.
Good morning. My name is Henry Ramirez. The church has historically taken actions when it needed to confront the rulers of society. We know what the popes did in Rome when the barbarians came down to Rome. We know that bishops from time to time have taken specific positions and declaimed or complained to the rulers. We know that prior to 1971, we did not have leadership in the hierarchy that was Spanish-speaking. Bishop Pat Flores and I worked. He couldn't do it, but I could do it. I sent cables from the White House to the Vatican complaining about the fact that we only had Irish bishops in the Southwest. And a papal nuncio was assigned, and he and I had a discussion where he told me that the Pope had said to him, when you get to Washington, meet with Dr. Ramirez, we're going to have 10 bishops, Spanish-speaking, very quickly. Thereafter, the hierarchy of Spanish-speaking bishops developed. A word was said about leadership being developed among these Catholic immigrants in this country. I would like to see leadership among the growing Hispanic hierarchy to take on people like Lamar Smith and his buddies in judiciary who are passing these horrible laws of mass deportation through the little rules of you can't do this and you can't do that if you don't have a document. They are separating families. They are hurting our people very badly. That's my question. Where's the leadership from the Hispanic bishops?
Well, I'll jump into the breach on that one. There are people here who could answer your question much better than I could that work at the Bishops' Conference, specifically in the area of immigration. The fact of the matter is that people are not always aware of everything that's going on, and as I've been at the Bishops' Conference for 3 years, and there's no question in my mind that there's an ongoing and a constant effort on the part of the Hispanic bishops, but the bishops in general, to engage the government on this question. Now, people can disagree about how to go about that, and that's an interesting question. But that I think Bishop Tamayo can enlighten us more on this.
Speaking as one of the Hispanic bishops in the United States, I would just want to share with you, and you have it within your own packet, the document that we wrote, which was the first document that was a joint statement of the U.S. bishops and the Mexican Bishops' Conference, Strangers No Longer. That was a voice that followed a first statement that U.S. bishops also supported, written by Hispanic bishops, which had Archbishop Flores writing that other first document, The Hispanic Bishops Speak to the Virgin. All of this was our voice to the people of the United States. That has been followed with other voices in Texas, or the Texas Catholic Conference, but other state conferences, and we have the New Mexico Conference director here, state director. All of us, along with the U.S. bishops' committees, and the Committee on Migration is one of those, that speaks to legislatures, that speaks to the people, that shares our social teachings, that motivates and encourages and fosters it. But as was indicated by one of the panelists, we're one voice out of those other 15 that write them in a negative way. and we're trying to persuade them and motivate them to see the positive contributions. We need others to join with us. But we are there with you, and we'll continue to stand with you and with our immigrant people. Thank you.
Just to add a word to what Bishop Tamai said, and to Henry, what you said, what you've done, I think we also need a lot more aggressive lay leadership, Henry, as you were. I think our bishops need the support. The statements they've made is in your documentation have been excellent, I think, in my opinion. But how do we get the Catholic people, and how do we get lay leadership that's involved in different aspects, whether it's banking or whether it's engineering or law? How do we get the Catholic leadership voice to be a part so the bishops don't speak by themselves alone? I think that's the difficulty. Their documents are excellent, but how do we get the laity? How do we get active laity? How do we get different institutions of the church to work with our bishops on this issue? To me, that's the big challenge. It's not that we don't have Episcopal leadership dealing with the top, but that we don't have them accompanied by the Catholic people. And I think that's the big challenge, to make it a real Catholic voice that comes forth. And I think it's needed more than ever. And I think, how do we transmit these documents to become part of the preaching of the church on Sundays, and part of the teaching in the catechism, and part of the discussion in Catholic, charismatic discussion groups and so forth? How do we really move that into a Catholic voice and a Catholic consciousness? I think that, to me, is the big challenge right now.
All three of you in different ways talked about culture and how important that is. And one of the most overlooked documents from the Bishops' Conference, I think it was 1997, was on the role of the Hispanic presence in the new evangelization. And there was really many powerful things, but one that just came to mind when hearing you today was that in 19th and 20th century American Catholicism, for understandable reasons, had a certain defensive posture against the mainstream culture, that Latinos coming from Catholic cultures, it just doesn't make sense to them. There is no idea of that defensiveness against the mainstream culture. And so now that the Holy Father's ramping up the emphasis on the new evangelization, and yet there's still a sense that present company accepted, some of our hierarchy don't even seem to exactly know what he's talking about. Can you see or address the ways that the Hispanic presence in America can help flesh out the new evangelization in America?
Well, one of the 5 priorities that the bishops approved 3 years ago was recognition of cultural diversity with emphasis on Hispanic ministry. This was a priority that we've been working on. And one of the first activities around that priority was the development of intercultural guidelines, cultural guidelines for evangelization. Bishop Ramirez was the chair of the task force that actually put together the ideas about what we were going to do. We are piloting, matter of fact, starting next month, a program called Building Intercultural Competence for Ministers. And the thrust of this program is sharing with people knowledge, attitudes, and skills around intercultural communication and intercultural relations. As you know, wherever you go, whether you're Hispanic or whatever you are, you're going to find yourself in parishes, in schools, in Catholic contexts where there's a lot of pluralism, where there's a lot of diversity. And we know that, but we have not necessarily been formed in what exactly does that involve in terms of skills and attitudes and knowledge. And so we're trying to get a program out there for every level of ministry in the church. We're going to take it all over the country. And the Hispanics are going to have to find out, for instance, about how to relate among themselves, because as you know, there are different generations of Hispanics, there are different nationalities of Hispanics and so forth. We have goodwill to do this, but we haven't necessarily been formed in this, so that's the point of this program. So that links, I think, directly to what we mean by the new evangelization, because that has to do with how people that already are Catholic are living their faith in the new, more secular environment in which we live, and that affects everybody.
Maybe a quick comment. I think, kind of a major difference between U.S. Catholicism and Latin American Catholicism was that basically U.S. Catholicism was the Catholicism of Europe that was brought over to the United States and Canada in a new way, but it's basically the Catholicism of the Counter-Reformation that came over after Trent and started to reestablish here. In Latin America, there was a very profound evangelization of the culture itself. So in many ways, theologically speaking, a new church was born. It wasn't just a church that migrated, but a new church was born in the interaction between the very profoundly religious peoples of Latin America and the Catholicism of, especially of Spain, that came over. And the evangelization process was really profound and recreated new symbols based on the old symbols, so that Catholicism became the deepest root of identity of Latin America. Pope Benedict refers to that in his presentation at Aparecida as the great treasure and soul of Latin American people. And I think that this coming together to form a culture with deep religious expressions is what the Latino brings to this country. And so I think in evangelization, there's something to learn there. I think that's sort of the challenge. But what can we learn about evangelizing culture itself, which Pope Paul VI already brings up in Evangelii Nunciandi, that the goal of evangelization is not just of persons, but of cultures themselves, to bring out a profound sense of the cultural expressions of the faith. And so I think that's one of the challenges that hopefully U.S. and Latino Catholicism can bring to the U.S. And it continues the process of its own evangelization, as its own purification and growth and development, and which is coming a lot today through biblical studies. The Latino world is fascinated with going directly into the Bible, partly because of Vatican II, partly because of the evangelical challenge. But the rise of biblical study groups to enrich the deep tradition that's there, not to destroy it or to go against it, but to enrich it and give it a new dynamism. And I find when that's working, the response is fantastic. Not just for Latinos, but for others who find excitement in the celebration of this religious feast in a collective, festive way.
Good morning. I'd like to address this issue of evangelization and the styles of evangelization, especially among immigrant groups, all immigrant groups, not just the Latino, Hispanic, but there's something that we're dealing with that's in common among the recent immigrants, whether they were recent in the 19th century, the 20th century, and our century now. And that is what happens in the family. The family is handed on successfully among recent immigrants, continues to be. When European immigrants came over, it was in the family. It was the inculcation of faith, and especially the Catholic tradition with home devotions and the insistence of participation in the parish and later in the parochial schools. So much happened. If it doesn't happen in the family, it seems like it's not going to happen at all. So I think what we need to do now, especially with I don't know what you're going to do with the older European Americans, the ones that you talked about, Alan, that are going to secularity, etc. But the more recent ones, I think one of the things we can do is to foster and encourage what is going on in the family right now, and underpin it and provide programs that will continue that family tradition of handing on the faith. I'm thinking, for example, of family catechesis. Some of my best parishes and the parishes in the Southwest that I see, what they're doing, they're training the parents. They teach the parents in the parish, not so much the children, but the parents, and how they are to have home catechesis and prepare in the home the children for first reconciliation and first Eucharist. So the parents do the work, and then they bring them to the parish for the sacraments. So that's one of the things I think we need to encourage and to promote is family catechesis.
Hello, I'm Ronnie Fellerath Lowell. I would just like to go back to the reference that was made to how lay people need to be involved, those in the pew, bankers, the professional community, actually lay Catholics. I do think the laity definitely needs to do its part. Just recently, as part of Pax Christi, the Catholic Peace Movement, we sponsored a talk for our local parish on immigration. We had over 50 people who were really very interested in the topic. But here's my concern. When we have the bishop's statement, welcome the stranger, and we want to publicize this and a just policy for immigrants, we don't hear about it in our parishes. Very, very infrequently. In the last several years, I think I heard one reference to immigration. And so we have this bishop's statement and a commitment on the part of the bishops. So how do we bridge this gap? And here's a question. Here I think is one of my reflections. When the bishops wanted the people in the pews to hear the pro-life message, they set up a mechanism. There was an office. There were funds. There was bishops and priests were asked to make a commitment to this. And somehow or other, if the bishops feel these other issues are important, of course the laity have to do their part. But where is this coming together and this bridge? Now, I recognize this is not an easy issue. I think of it an even more difficult issue, the issue of war and peace. That once these issues come up in a parish, there is a difference of opinion among adult Catholics about how these things should be implemented. And as soon as there is controversy, everyone gets nervous, instead of recognizing that conflict is an opportunity for understanding. And I think the issue is really larger than just immigration, but certainly it applies to immigration. And I hope that the bishops are thinking in this direction, because as a lay person, I certainly am.
I think there's a question there about the gap between Episcopal pronouncements and what happens in the parishes. Would anyone?
First of all, thank you, Ronnie. Thank you for that observation. I think that's what I was referring to in my own presentation. How do we see, for myself, I see the immigration issue an extension of pro-life, because it is a life issue. This life issue that's breaking up families, that leading kids to slow death, if you want, because they feel abandoned, they get into drugs, they get into jail. It is a pro-life issue in many ways. And I think we should extend this, not just to get them out of the womb, but to lead them to the fullness of life. I think here, Cardinal Bernardine's beautiful seamless garment idea. We're for life all the way. And I think that's important, and I do hope we find ways, again, some of these good pronouncements into the ordinary preaching. And it is, to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfort, or something like that. How do we shake our people up a bit? But I think we have good people, but I think that the way the media has put this whole thing up has really criminalized and just turned into the ugly monster that's going to destroy America. I think part of it is changing that mindset. That mindset. We have good people, but when good people are totally manipulated to see things in a wrong way, they're going to act in that way. So I think, how can we get all the different markets of the church to see a new vision of that these people are human. They're human beings. They're struggling for the basic things that all of us struggle for.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I'm kind of tall, so I don't know if you guys can hear me. A lot of what you were discussing in this opening part of the conference is dealing with the immigration and what we can do here in the United States. But I think it's completely relevant, and it's very important that we do discuss that side of it. But I think one of the things that I rarely hear any talk about is with immigration, in particular the immigrants from Mexico, is, well, is there anything that we as Americans or we as Catholics can do to help curb the situation in Mexico with all the violence and the drugs? And I don't think that there would be as large an exodus of Mexicans trying to come into the U.S. if the situation in Mexico, if there was economic opportunities and if there wasn't the threat where they can be kidnapped and mass murdered. And so I was wondering if there's anything we as Americans, or maybe something with our policy, or just being part of the Catholic Church, since it does have a unique position in that it is universal. We do have dioceses in all different types of countries. Like, is there anything that we could do to make it a more permanent solution? Because I'm sure Mexicans don't want to immigrate to the U.S. if they didn't have to. If they could stay in their own country, they would, but they don't have the opportunities. And I think the same goes for other Latin American and other developing nations as well. So I was wondering if maybe you guys can comment on some of the progress that's been made, or suggestions and things like that.
I think that later on we probably will hear from people that are much more knowledgeable and that can respond even better than I can to that question. But I will say this, that this discussion, this particular cycle of discussion about immigration that we've been going through, and you know, as you look at American history, you see we tend to do it in cycles. It's been prolonged because of the impasse, the political impasse. One of the results of that has been that a lot of thought, a lot of reflection actually has been devoted to the issues around migration, more than I think ever in the past. And that reflection reflects engagement with what's happening all over the world, because I think it's important to acknowledge, the way I think your question does, that what we're talking about is not just something that affects the United States. Actually, migration, the movement of people, there are more than 200 million people migrating in the world. And our country is not the country that is dealing with the greatest challenge of migration. There are countries much poorer than ours that have to deal with both internal migrations that are tremendous, the displacement of peoples, or the movement across borders. But there is a sense in the church, in Catholic social teaching, certainly in the work of the Pontifical Council for Migrants in Rome, which is calling meetings and gatherings and putting information together from all over the world. For instance, in November, I was in Bogota at a meeting of all of the churches of Latin America to talk about what's going on in the movement of people. So, yes, solidarity, that word, that concept, is something maybe that in the American context we find a little bit difficult to get our mind around, you know. Maybe we're a little too individualistic, but the Catholic Church puts a great value on solidarity, and I think we have an opportunity to contribute that to the forming of the American conscience today. But we have to get the information, but more than information about what's really going on and the implications around migration. Probably more important would be we have to develop another narrative, another story. Americans in general, if they had a benign attitude toward immigrants, used to, get that benign attitude thinking about the Statue of Liberty and thinking about the fact that probably their grandfather was an immigrant from some country, these kinds of, and stories, about the immigrant character of our American society. That narrative is not producing the attitudes and the mindset and the openness that it did at one time. Maybe because of 9/11, because of fear of terrorism, because of fear of foreigners, because I don't know, all the factors that have led to the ineffectiveness of the stories or the narratives that we've had. The best way to deal with that is to get flesh and blood immigrants in front of you and to hear their stories, because then what's been going on lately isn't going to succeed, because we've been dehumanizing the immigrant. We've been making them an object, illegal immigrants, as if a human being could be illegal, you know. No human being can ever be illegal, you know. But we talk that way, and therefore we make an object out of people who are subjects. And to the extent that the Catholic Church, our humanistic tradition in Catholicism, can say, hey, what's going on here, and get us back to a more humanistic view of what's going on in our relationship to, you know, people throughout the world, I think that's a great opportunity for our Catholic tradition today.
Just to add a quick word again, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. For example, I work with a group that's offering microloans in northern Mexico, loans of $75, $100, something, to start small industry, and it's amazing how well it's working. So I think there's small things that can be done. I think one of the major problems is the drug violence. And there's the drug violence because in this country there's a demand for drugs, and the demand keeps growing. And also because the sale of weapons from this side to Mexico is a tremendous business. So we're selling the weapons and buying the drugs, and that's at the basis of the drug stuff in Mexico. So how can we work to maybe to lessen the use of drugs in this country, maybe to curtail some way the sale of guns and ammunition that go into Mexico that's creating so much of the violence that forces people to come over. So I think things are being done, and definitely not enough, and definitely what can be done is a big, big question. But I think the efforts to try to help in individual ways in some way. Again, we have the same group that I work with a bit. We try to relocate people that are deported back into Mexico and try to match them with a job opportunity. It's not easy and it's not solving the whole thing, but there's small efforts to reach out in a very practical, realistic way.
I want to thank you all for especially bringing up a topic of interest, which is the new evangelization concerning immigration. It struck a chord concerning a term used by John Paul II that was more ecumenical, the notion of the mutual exchange of gifts. It seems that instead of trying to maybe force the issue concerning immigration and integration, that there really should be a Christian humanism that's being focused here. I, being Latino myself, having grown up in Miami all my life and recently emigrated now to DC to study here at CUA, I'm a teaching fellow as well here. One thing that struck me is, in many ways, how the American dream has been, in a sense, has been adopted or assimilated by Latinos in such a materialistic way. And it seems that the growth of secularism, even in the United States among Catholics, its essential root is precisely this notion that the American dream is to be an isolated, self-made person, man or woman, who at the end achieves a certain financial stability. I think that as a church, one thing that we are to recognize is more than simply assimilating, let's say, cultures, saying, well, we're going to tolerate, you know, Hispanics or people from Haiti or people from other regions that are also suffering very much. I think it's important to assume that already in our own lifetime, there is a type of Christianity that is losing that has eroded the very soil, the very roots of what makes it alive. And that's its basic claim on our own life, that it is important, that somehow this faith communicates an essential component of what makes us human. I think one thing that it may be just, you know, my own concern, but as I see more and more this speaking of dialogue, you know, or of tolerance for immigration, one thing I think that we are to take into account is the paradigm by which we even profess our faith. It cannot be solely based on, you know, a particular group, or if, you know, I've heard a lot of comments which have been very good concerning, you know, where are the bishops' committees or different things, but it doesn't really lie only on that. It really lies, I think, essentially at going back at a real and genuine Christian humanism that applies in a universal way to the heart of the person. I think until we really touch base with that reality, that it's not an issue of offering just more money or jobs or opportunities, but that it integrates that. It gives a reason why we should immigrate or why we should come and work harder. That all we're going to see is a growth in a staleness, in a sense, of those that are attending church or those that are growing even in our own Hispanic communities that may have come from a long tradition of Catholicism. I think that one question that concerns me, why not focus more on this notion of mutual self-exchange? And then concerning that, why not this mutual self-exchange, I think, draw an impetus on a Christian humanism? Why not that focus?
Well, I think that, you're pointing something out that I think is very central. It has to do with a challenge to American culture, because American culture pretty much is predicated on the notion that we are free-floating individuals, and we're all pursuing our interests and, climbing up the ladder of success or whatever. And even we Catholics think that way, So it's a question of conversion, isn't it? It's really being who we are. That's the underlying question. Really being who we are. And the coming of new blood is an opportunity for us to get with this agenda in a clearer way. I think that was the point I was trying to make, but I think you made it very well.
Yeah, I have a question. My name's Alan. My question is, what can you say to my heart? I just spent 60 days wrestling with legislators who were trying to take away driver's license from undocumented immigrants, and something hit me in my own prejudice. I mean, what do we say to the heart? All this Charlie Sheen, all this business on the news is just overwhelmed with Charlie Sheen, and I can't stand Charlie Sheen. And my own brother, who's Charlie, and I'm an Alan, it's kind of funny because that's the names they use in that thing. But my brother Charlie says, he's a Latino. And I said, oh, pobrecito, he needs counseling, poor guy needs counseling. And I realized, my God, my own prejudice, that I couldn't stand him 1 minute, and then the next minute, because he's a Latino, I got to get him some counseling. What would you say to me that would change my heart in the same way I try to tell a legislator to the heart? I mean, getting down to the nitty-gritty one-on-one, what would you say to the heart?
First of all, just a little anecdote. I think you know the origin of Charlie Sheen's last name. When his father decided to change his name from Esteves so it could be more acceptable in the American scene, his idol was Bishop Sheehan. So that's the grandfather of Charlie Sheen in some ways. So, and he's by name, by name. How do you speak to the heart? I think you posed a marvelous, marvelous question. Sometimes it's not just about information, but it's about information that touches the heart. And I think that's really, to me, that's the ultimate goal of true preaching, is to move the heart, to really have the heart, the loving heart of God, of excessive love, a love that goes beyond what we would consider the rational limits placed by our culture or something else. And I think that is the great challenge in our catechesis, in our preaching, not just information, but information that moves the heart to action, that creates a loving heart. Just exactly how to do it, I find myself many times is human stories. I find that sometimes it's the human stories to put, as Alan was saying earlier, to put a real face and a body to the immigrant, not just immigrants in an abstract way, but a human being, to see the reality of the living. It moves people. We have several videos. I don't know if any of you have seen the film. If you haven't seen, I recommend it highly. It's a very beautiful but extremely painful film. The title is in Spanish, Sin Nombre, without a name. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it highly to you. It's the plight of Central American immigrants trying to come through Mexico to the United States. And it is really an experience of hell, but I recommend it highly because that type of movie, I think, moves the heart. Say, what can we do to alleviate this type of human suffering? And so I think stories, personal testimonies, I think and the challenge for us as preachers and teachers and all that, to move not just information, not just statement, how do we move the heart? And I think that's the big challenge, because it's the heart that moves people to change. Once you change your heart, you begin to see things in a new way. And that's what to put on the mind and the heart of Christ. And so that the heart will actually see things in a new way because the heart has been moved and changed. And to me, that's the great challenge we have. And I personally find that putting flesh and blood, human stories of reality in front of people, what moves people. Remember in the Vietnam thing, that one image of the little child running down? I mean, that changed
incredibly, because that moves the heart, compassion. I mean, right now, I'm sure the rest of you, when I see some of the images from Japan, I kind of say, hey, I got to get out and do something. I don't know what. So to move the heart. And I think that's where maybe we need to work at, not just information, we need information, but we need to go beyond information to move the hearts to action.
Father Dick, you drew the distinctions between the European American middle class church that's in decline and the new vibrant and church of opportunity and immigrants. And I'm wondering, the decline, there are lots of reasons for that. But one of the central reasons is the decline in a number of priests. So we have mergers and closings and all the rest of it trying to adjust to that. I'm wondering two questions. First, do you see these two groups in the future as maybe competing forces for church leadership's attention and resources, one? And two, is there a discussion anywhere among Hispanic Catholic leadership about a new model for parochial, for the parish? The leadership question is still going to be the same if there are not enough priests, and we're told by demographers there aren't going to be to repeat that old model. So is there any discussion anywhere about that?
Well, I think there's a growing realization that something's going on and that we have a number of issues that we have to face around, starting with nitty-gritty things like finances and what have you. But just to give you an example, we have gotten used to thinking of our American Catholic Church history in terms of, the ethnic parishes of 80, 90 years ago that were very successful, of which there still are a few, are out there, but certainly that's not where the action is. Then we thought of the suburban parishes, and in the 70s, 80s, we were really, going out into the suburbs, and this process of becoming more middle class and so forth was at its high point, and construction of Catholic schools and parishes and all that kind of thing. Well, now we're in another phase. This phase, some people have called it the phase, Father Brett Hoover, for instance, calls it the shared parish, because the shared parish is the one that you're finding more and more in our country. It's not the suburban one where there's pretty much uniform European American English language services, but you're going to find number of parishes now where there are 2 or 3 or 4 or Lord knows what number of groups, different cultural groups, different racial groups. Pastors, parish leaders are really being challenged to know how to work with this tremendous diversity, but we really don't have much of a choice. The process of clustering brings together parishes that in the past probably wouldn't have been brought together because of the different people that make them up, but now we really don't have a lot of choices. So that's why we really have to get with intercultural relations. We have to become much more expert, because now we can't develop these groups the way we've tended to develop them, giving each group their leadership, having their institutions and so forth. If we're going to be a church, we're going to have to figure out how not to compete. I don't know if you're familiar with Mary Oates. Mary Oates wrote a book on the history of Catholic philanthropy. And the main point that she makes is that the dynamic that led to the institutional wealth of the Catholic Church had everything to do with the rivalry among the different ethnic groups, to build their churches, to have their services and so forth and so on. Well, we're not there. This is another period that we're in where we're not able to create that good sense of rivalry, I guess, that existed between the Italians and the Poles and the Irish and Germans. For various reasons, we are putting more and more people in fewer and fewer parishes. And so we need to become more expert on how the church can be even more what it professes to be, a communion in diversity, but to really be it in a way that we haven't had to be it in the past. And that's the reality. And I would say, by the way, not just in our country, in the global church as well. But that's going to take a lot of thought. We're going to have to become expert in culture. I agree with Cardinal Dulles toward the end of his life, who devoted many of his talks to the question of evangelization and the new evangelization. He was of the mind, I believe, if I've had this conversation with him, he was of the mind that for whatever reason, the church's teaching about the evangelization of cultures has not been terribly well received in our country. In other words, we talk that language, but we don't necessarily grasp what it really is all about. Well, now, this is going to be the test. We either have to grasp it or we're not going to be very successful in working with this cultural diversity that is the reality of the church moving forward. So we have to get better at that. And I would say Pope Benedict, following the lead of John Paul II, speaks about the encounter of cultures in a very simple way. He says, it's about a giving and about a receiving. So the American experience is going to give something to the immigrants, and the immigrants are going to give something to the American experience. And if we have that kind of attitude, then I think we'll be able to get somewhere.
Good morning. My name is Sandy McGraw. I'm from a parish in southern Maryland, and I have two quick questions. My first is, I'm a real proponent on what you say about putting a face to an issue, because people generally think about immigration and have an attitude, and until they meet an immigrant, they have a whole different perspective. So my question is, and that happened to me. I had two gentlemen that came to work for me, and now I have lots of friends and am the godmother of all the Latinos in southern Maryland. So my question is this: does any message get to the Latinos that says, make your own outreach? Because I think that's so vital to changing a community at the local level. And it has to be changed at the local level. And as another point, the people in the pews are not hearing it. They're not getting that message. I wish they were, but they're not getting that message. So, number one, is anything being done to pass that message on to our Latino and Latina friends to reach out to, you know, the people that in whose community they live? Number one. And number two, as a very pragmatic thing, is your organization or your committee reaching out on specific things? For instance, the DREAM Act. Is there a national effort to get behind the DREAM Act? I know in Maryland we have the Maryland Catholic Conference. Well, you know, they always do something on immigration, but it's not hard-hitting. And so my question is, do we take things like the issues of getting driver's licenses, because they're going to drive whether they've got a driver's license or not, the issue of reaching out to these children who are getting out of high school and have to have some path to hope, you know, forget about citizenship, just hope. Those are the things that I think if it was targeted to something specific, you'd have a better chance of people understanding what the real issue is in human terms. So my question is, number one, are we talking to the Latinos in the pews? And number two, are we taking specific issues and targeting them? Thank you very much.
Well, I think as we heard, there's kind of an unflinching, constant effort on the part of, for instance, Catholic conferences to tackle those questions about driver's license, about many of the specific issues. And certainly at the level of the Bishops' Conference, there's a lot of encouragement and lobbying, and that's being encouraged. And so there is. That's a story that needs to be communicated, I suppose. You may not be aware of it, but yes, but could we do more? I'm sure that we could. And secondly, with respect to how the Latinos themselves are stepping up, I think that's a great point, because sometimes there's a tendency for groups to become victims, you know, and Lord knows there's all kinds of reasons why they feel like victims, because sometimes they are, but that's not a good psychological stance to take. So I was so delighted. Just 3 weeks ago, I met the leader of the group of Latino young people, a Catholic immigrant young lady herself from El Salvador, who is the head of the organization of Latino youth in New York, who came forth as undocumented young people because of the DREAM Act, to tell their story about being undocumented, about how they came as young children to this country, and why the DREAM Act makes all kinds of eminent sense. And they're there, and they're not letting down. They're in front of the cameras. They're articulating their issues. Yes, so is something happening? I think it's a good news, you know, in the midst of a lot of bad news that we have. It's good news. But I'm sure there are a lot of other things we can do as well.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. We will have a break of, sorry. Oh, okay.
I just have one quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Kevin Appleby at the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops. I'm going to put you on the spot. One of the trends that we're seeing in this whole recent immigration debate and this whole wave of immigrants is that the evangelization of the new immigrants, especially young people. And trends and reports are showing that other faiths are doing a better job of recruiting new immigrants than our faith is, even though the majority of immigrants are Catholic. Evangelical churches, Protestant churches, are making inroads into the Catholic population, especially young people who are newly arrived to the country, in part because they're doing a better job of helping them integrate as well. Is this a concern for the church, or is there something that the church should be doing to respond to this trend? It seems some commentators would suggest that the church is sort of resting on its laurels in this regard, and that is sort of not minding the store when it comes to evangelizing new immigrants, and that this trend is an ongoing trend. How would you, advise the bishops on how to respond to this trend?
Yeah, very quickly, and thank you, Kevin, for asking that question. I think many of the immigrants today, at least from Latin American immigrants, come alone. That's an important factor. Come alone, and they look to the church as a place of fellowship, not just attending Mass, even though it might be a very vibrant Mass. They look at a church as a place to, quote, hang around. I think the evangelical churches and this more storefront church are doing a great job in inviting them in and providing fellowship. And I think that's something that we could really improve on in Catholicism and invite them in different ways. For example, for Latin American, soccer is great. And the church could provide a place for soccer teams and soccer playing. Music, they love musical groups, and where they can express themselves musically. A place where they can, I think the church is doing a good job in some places, but in many places, the immigrant still has the feeling of being, at best, tolerated. And unfortunately, that's still a reality in many, many parishes around the country. So that's why in my presentation, said, how can we develop a welcoming, a spirituality in our parishes, a real profound spirituality of welcoming. And welcoming with joy, because in every immigrant, there's a new gift coming in. And to develop that positive prejudice in favor of the immigrant. That we're excited because they're bringing something into us. And to receive them with that excitement. I think the Catholic Church in that really has done a lot, is doing a lot, but has a lot more to do. And I think we need to build upon the image of success where it is working well, and to take it across the country. Because we do have, and I work a lot with our ecumenical, with evangelical pastors and so forth, there's a lot of sincerity amongst them. There's a lot of sincerity of reaching out, as several have said, you know, if your own mother cannot feed you, then the neighbor has an obligation to feed you. So if Mother Catholic Church cannot nourish spiritually, we have an obligation to reach out. They don't necessarily even see it as competition. Many of them see it very sincerely as reaching out to nourish what Mother Church is not nourishing. So I think we do have a great job. We've done a great job in many areas, but in many more areas, we have a lot more to do that we can do, and it'll bring life to the church.
Just one little addition to that would be, insofar as there is success in working with the immigrant young people, I think we need to acknowledge, as I mentioned earlier, that it is the movements, not so much the parish organization or diocesan organization, but it tends to be the movements like the Charismatic Renewal or the Cursillo or something like that, that de facto is evangelizing our Latinos right now in significant numbers. It's not the only thing. And there are other things that we could mention, but I think we sometimes forget that that's really needs to be an integral part of our vision of what's going on in church. It's not just what happens in the parish or the diocese. There are other things going on, and we need to integrate all of that.
As someone raised in a Protestant church, and also the person who gets to have the last word because I'm standing here, may I say that Catholics have a structural problem. Protestants just have a lot more clergy to laity. The ratio is much better. I gained a great many things when I became a Catholic. What I lost was the luxury of having a pastor who knew my name. It's a gamble these days. So I think that might be worth thinking about. We will convene again at about 11:30. Please enjoy your now truncated break. The next panel promises to be as excellent as this one.